It's just about 6 o'clock, so I think we'll get started. I hope you all have had a chance to help yourselves to the delicious food that's here, compliments of our host, Restaurant 46. So let's give a little round of applause. Thank you, Restaurant 46. This is an Appetite for Life program, which is part of the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill's Nutrition Research Institute, which, if you don't know, is just over yonder that way on the North Carolina Research Campus. Tonight, you're going to hear from Dr. Steve Hursting. He is a professor of nutrition at UNC Chapel Hill and faculty researcher at the Nutrition Research Institute. He has a Ph.D. in nutritional biochemistry and a Master of Public Health in Nutritional Epidemiology from UNC Chapel Hill. He completed his postdoctoral training in molecular biology and cancer prevention as a Cancer Prevention Fellow at the National Cancer Institute, which is one of the National Institutes of Health. He has been an assistant professor at the University of Texas M.D. Anderson Cancer Center, where he directed a multidisciplinary research program in nutrition and cancer prevention. He was deputy director of the National Cancer Institute's Office of Preventive Oncology, Division of Cancer Prevention, and an investigator in that center's Center for Cancer Research, where he was chief of the Nutrition and Molecular Carcinogenesis section of the Laboratory of Biosystems and Cancer. All of which is to say that he is the man from whom you want to hear information about the underlying diet cancer associations. And so with that, I give you Steve Hursting.
Thank you, Suzanne. Well, thank you, Suzanne, and good evening, everyone. What are you doing on this beautiful day and inside? This is incredible weather we're having for middle of October, isn't it? Well, thank you for coming. This is certainly a topic I care a lot about, and it looks like a lot of you care a lot about it too. So, thanks for sharing your evening with me. Yes, I came home about 2 years ago. I trained at UNC, met my wife, who's from Durham, while a grad student at UNC. Then I kind of traveled around to Bethesda, Maryland, Texas. Kind of did that bounce back a few times, and always wanted to get home. So I am back, and this place is fantastic. If you haven't had a chance to tour the Nutrition Research Institute, Suzanne can arrange that, and just beautiful facilities, and very proud that our state is investing and our university is investing in really having an impact on metabolic disease and understanding the underpinnings of these challenges that are really affecting virtually every cause of death that we face. So tonight we're going to talk about breast cancer. It's National Breast Cancer Awareness Month, so hence the topic. And it's one I also study pancreatic cancer and a bit of colon cancer too, but breast cancer is my main focus of the lab, and it's something we really need to tackle. So we'll get into kind of what's sort of is cancer in general, but also we'll emphasize breast cancer, given the month we're in and this effort to make breast cancer kind of at the forefront of our concerns. Actually, the American Cancer Society, with I think several breast cancer advocate groups, started that movement, and I think it's really had an impact on awareness of this issue. So we'll talk about what is cancer and from various aspects, actually, and including a little biology. So if you're not really into the biology, we'll go quickly through that. But I can't help myself on that. We'll get into breast cancer prevention. What are some ways to have an impact on this disease? We said, is diet a factor? You can imagine that, given that we're at the Nutrition Research Institute, we sure think it is, and I think I can convince you that diet can have a major impact on both the risk and the outcome of this disease. So we'll get into that a little bit, and we'll focus on phytochemicals. And I see some good phytochemical consumption. Anything green and red and yellow and that sort of thing from fruits and vegetables. You're getting some good things there. That's one aspect of the nutrition story we'll get into. The other main one is really the obesity epidemic and how it's impacting many diseases, but breast cancer, unfortunately, is one of the sort of obesity-driven diseases that we're dealing with. So we'll talk about that. And I can't help but give a few examples of some of the nutrition and cancer prevention research going on at the Nutrition Research Institute. So we'll end with just a few examples of some of the things we're doing there. So that's the evening. Now, we've got a pretty big group, but if there's a question that pops up, please feel free to raise your hand, shout it out. We can do this. I don't know about you guys. I've been watching an awful lot of the election stuff. I'm kind of sick of it. I'm kind of glad we're not talking about anything about that tonight. But we can do this sort of what's that called? The sort of the more open format where people can pop up and ask questions. Okay. Yeah, that's. I'm not sure I'm going to watch it. I'm so tired of that stuff. That's oh boy. Let's talk about cancer. So let's start with Webster's. The definition that you find kind of classic is it refers to a malignant tumor of potentially unlimited growth that expands locally by invasion and systemically by metastasis. And the key word here is really unlimited growth. This is an aberrant sort of growth disease that occurs because of some genetic changes, and we'll get into what that looks like. But we'll unpack what this cancer story is about. Let's start. Cancer is a major killer. Worldwide, cancer became the #1 cause of death in 2010, and it's widening the gap here. And so this is clearly something we've got to do something about. This is in the deaths in the millions. So we're getting up to 12 million deaths from cancer every year and across the world. So it's not just a U.S. problem or a Western world problem. This is something that's affecting the whole world. You see, heart disease is second, stroke. These are all diet-related diseases, certainly. But and you might maybe even as recently as 10 or 15 years ago, you might have gotten some pushback if you said cancer is a diet-related disease. How can that be? It's a genetic disease. You know, that was the thinking, even as recently as a decade ago. But we now know diet has a major impact. Yes, genes have a major role in susceptibility, but what we eat, what we do in terms of lifestyle, has a big impact. So I see a hand already. Yes.
Can you put a percentage on what percent of cancer?
Yes, I can. The estimates are about 25% of cancers. I'll show some data on that, but the estimates are a fairly conservative estimate is 25. Some of my colleagues say 40, up to 40, but I think a conservative estimate is about a quarter could be really attributed to diet. And much of that is obesity driven. That's really the enemy number one right now. And we'll get into why. But up about a quarter to a third, diet related. Another about a third tobacco related. There's 2/3 if we can take care of those two factors. And we'll get into some of those risk factors in a bit. But a major killer. Again, it's #1 cause of death worldwide. Over 14 million new cancer cases, and this is expected to about double to 25 million by 2030. So this is unfortunately an increasing problem if we don't do something about it. And certainly not much you can do about your genes, but there's a lot you can do about diet and other lifestyle factors. And that to me is the key. And we'll unpack this as we go. Here's the U.S. story. These are estimated deaths in the U.S. Due to cancer. The data is always a couple years behind. So this is from the American Cancer Society this year, but we're looking at what happened, kind of what was going on up to about 2 years ago. And you see lung cancer, again, that's the tobacco effect going on. Lung and bronchus, #1 in both men and women, but breast cancer, #2. And about 15% of all cancer deaths are from breast cancer. Breast doesn't show up in men, but I'll show you that in terms of breast cancer in the U.S., 232,000 new cases expected this year. about 40,000 deaths from breast cancer. And so if it feels like, lots of people how many have been touched by it? I know I have. Most of us have. If it feels like this is going on an awful lot, it is. And this is a major problem. As men, we don't completely escape it, although as you can see, the risk of breast cancer in men is much lower than in women. But about 2,600 new breast cancer cases in men, about 400 deaths. You don't hear much about that, but it's actually on the rise as well. And actually this week of Breast Cancer Awareness Week, this is Men's Breast Cancer Awareness Week. I'm sorry, Breast Cancer Awareness Month. This is week that the men get a little attention in this. So worth mentioning for sure. Okay, so there it is. What is cancer? It's a major killer and something we really need to work at to improve this. Let's think about it from a biological point of view. What is cancer? And you think about cancer, you think about the tumor, right? The end stage of this. But really, what I'll encourage you to do is think about cancer as a process. It's really a multi-step process, and hopefully you can see some of that from the back. But you go from a normal group of cells here, where something happens. Often it's a carcinogen. Unfortunately, cigarette smoke has about 250 different carcinogens, so that can impact DNA. It might be sun exposure. That can actually, the UV radiation can serve as a form of a carcinogen. So something that changes the DNA a bit. Sometimes these are inherent. Sometimes we're born with some of these changes. So it's not always something from the outside, but often it is. That changes a group of normal cells to what we call an initiated cell population. And these are some change in DNA. It could be actually a mutation, an actual base change. So the alphabet that makes us up maybe gets altered in some way, a misspelling, if you will. It could be another kind of related change that makes the interpretation of that spelling a little bit incorrect. But that will be enough to give a growth advantage. Remember, we said this was a growth disease to a group of cells within the population of cells here that grow out. And again, if that group of cells stays local, stays kind of contained, we consider that a benign tumor. So you probably have heard that expression. I was a lifeguard. Unfortunately, as a high school student, so I got a lot of sun exposure. So every 6 months, I have these little dysplastic nevi, these benign neoplasias removed. And so they're not cancer. They're benign lesions. They're little groups of cells that they get to a point and they stop and don't look so good, so they chop them out. I mean, it hurts for a few days. But these are not killers. The dangerous part of cancer is what we call malignancy, and it's this aggressive, invasive form of cell growth that occurs. And so the ability to grow beyond the local environment and get into the bloodstream and spread, that's the dangerous part of cancer. Yes?
I know you're talking about it being a growth, but I also understand that it's a death situation as well. The cells do not die.
Yes.
Does not happen.
That's right.
In the normal process. Is that correct?
Normal cells have a nice control, so they're right in that balance of growth and death. And so too much growth, they're controlled and often will be killed. There's sort of a self-destruct mechanism that is in place. Cancer cells have turned that off, and so part of the DNA change is to actually activate growth genes and turn off these regulatory genes, many of which are these cell death regulators. So it's exactly right. You want balance, and we're way off balance here if you look at a cancer cell in that kind of growth death. So that's the general story. Let's think about breast cancer. Really cool organ. Obviously a specialized role here to make milk, right, for the little ones. And so one thing you see about the breast here, you've got these ducts that really sort of pump the milk out to the awaiting little baby. And so that's a characteristic of breast cancer is most of the cancer arises in these ducts, actually, and the cells related to these ducts. These lobules are kind of the milk-making factories. And a more rare form of breast cancer can form in these lobules. Most of the breast cancer, at least in the United States, are ductal cancers. You see some muscle here. This is sort of the chest wall. And one thing I want to point out, because this is a confusing, complicated disease, isn't it? So I thought spending a minute on this would be good. This is because the tumors are forming in these ducts. This is a sort of a cross section of the duct itself. So think about almost like a garden hose, if you will. We're looking right down the sort of the hose here. And there's a group of these cells that are sort of protecting the epithelium of this duct, and those are the cells that get altered when it comes to cancer. And so in a normal state, you see they're nice and structured, and you see plenty. If you're looking down the garden hose here, see plenty of space for the milk to come through. Is really what that's for. What happens in cancer is this is another cross section. This starts to fill in with these abnormally growing cancer cells. And the initial form of this is, you may have heard of ductal carcinoma in situ, DCIS. You have, yep, you've had it. You've had it. So it's luckily almost back to the benign setting. It's kind of just crossing the line in benign. One of the controversies right now is, what do you do about that, right? Do you actually go aggressively after those, or is it a watchful waiting kind of story? They went for yours. That's you did the surgery. That's often that's a tough choice, because these are just kind of crossing the cancer line, if you will. But most of these stay local. But you see what's going on here. They're filling in that what's called the lumen here of this duct, and starting to go. So that's the ductal carcinoma in situ. The really dangerous aspect of the cancer here is when that progresses to a point where they're invading and spreading outside of that local environment. Here you see that lumen filling in with these growing cancer cells, and then they're spilling out from the local environment and heading to things like livers and lungs and brain, and this is where it gets very, very dangerous. So I don't want to dwell on it, but this is about 80% of breast cancer, of these ductal carcinomas, as they're called, and you can kind of see what's going on here is where they're just growing and in a very aggressive fashion, spreading out and causing their trouble. So we'll get back to sort of how do we target some of these things. But one other aspect of breast cancer and many cancers is that they're preventable, and that addresses that earlier question. Here's diet, about 30% by many estimates. Smoking also about 30%. So there's our getting close to 2/3. You see, some infections can cause cancer. HPV, for example, human papillomavirus is a major cause of cervical cancer. The estimates are about 10% of cancers are caused by either a viral or a bacterial infection. Sun exposure, although not, maybe about 8%, but certainly a meaningful exposure. So if you're unfortunately, if you're my age, you're in the dermatologist quite a bit. I see someone pretty young here who, so careful with the sunscreen. This is a good time to do that. Alcohol is actually a risk factor for breast cancer. It's a weak risk factor. It appears to kind of tie in with estrogen signaling. But alcohol, and we've got an alcohol expert here. Certainly other cancers, you think about esophageal, where there's constant exposure to the alcohol, it's a more major risk factor. But on the order of about 5% of cancers thought to be attributed to alcohol. And on down the line, what might surprise you is sort of getting to the genetics. The family history here is not, if you inherit those genes, you may have heard of BRCAs, BRCA1, BRCA2, or breast cancer genes. Now, if you inherit that gene, your risk of breast cancer is very high, but it's a fairly rare inheritance pattern. So overall, these are not major. They're certainly important, but they're not in the teens or 20s in terms of percent. They're fairly low contributors overall to the picture. You might also think pollution might be a bigger risk factor, and that was certainly the thought in the 70s, even in the 80s when I was in grad school, that industrial pollution, the environmental contaminants might be a big part of the story. And again, they are if you're exposed to large amounts. If you're an industrial worker, there's a spill in your plant, that certainly can be linked to some cancers. But overall, it's fairly low contributor. What surprises most people is its lifestyle. That's the big driver. Diet, smoking. I would put in exercise and other components to this too, and we'll talk about those. So good news, many, not all, but many cancers and many breast cancers are preventable if we can kind of fine tune the sort of interventions and prevention strategies that we need. I love this cartoon. It certainly gets at this point. Many diseases are a product of really genes and environment. It's that interaction. It's important. And I would say cancer is probably the poster child for that interaction because clearly it's a genetic disease. You don't have cancer if you don't have those DNA changes. But those DNA changes don't dictate, certainly don't dictate when you get cancer because diet and other factors can have a huge impact on sort of the prognosis of that. But in many cases, even with these DNA changes, there's growing evidence that prudent dietary changes may actually help prevent completely the development of those, even in the face of specific known carcinogenic changes like we talked about. So, so what we're born with some potential here. Some differences in susceptibility, across us. Some are born with a fairly high susceptibility. That doesn't mean we can't do. There's nothing we can do about it. I think that's been the good news because I think certainly in my memory, I think when I was in grad school, there was still a prevailing thought. Once you had a particular kind of susceptibility, there wasn't much you can do about it. If you had a family history, well, there's not much you can do there. That's not true. There's a lot we can do, and that's something that that interaction between your genes, what you have inherited, and the environment is critical to this. So let's look at the risk factors that are known for breast cancer. Now, some of them we can't do much about. Again, some of these genetic factors are there. Menstrual history has an impact on the risk of breast cancer, whether you're and one point that's coming clear is in our society we've really changed a number of factors that are showing up in some of these hormone-related risk factors. The age of first period certainly 100 years ago, but even I think the data is pretty clear. Even about 50 years ago, so really one generation. The average age for a girl's first menstrual period was about 17 and a half, 18 years. You know what it is now? 10 and a half. 10 and a half. So that's one generation. I'm not sure it was quite the 17. Might have been more like 16, 50 years ago. Certainly the data I've seen is a 100-year mark, like the frontier time. Way up there, and so we've changed that. And I think it's a function of we're more sedentary. Our diet's certainly changed. We're getting less exercise. That part of it is a big factor.
Probably too, maybe the hormones and all this that they put in our foods now.
Possibly contributing. Yeah. Certainly the way we eat is very different, and that's something we'll get into. We've gone away from whole food kinds of things to these processed foods. Some of these can contribute. So that's a big deal. Exposure to radiation, maybe if you've had X-rays for something else as an early, that can be a risk factor. Small one, it would seem, but can contribute. I don't know if you're familiar with this DES story, diethylstilbestrol. It was used to prevent birth defects in the, I guess, late 40s to mid 50s or so. Is that right? And children who were born from mothers who were treated with DES, it turns out have a much higher risk of breast cancer. And so there's a, it's a fairly small window when this was used, but those children, as they've grown up now to be women, have a higher risk for breast cancer, and that's something. So it's not affecting huge numbers, but if you were treated with that, or if you're in that population, it's I think about a tenfold risk. You're a DS kid, yeah.
So it's if your mother was treated when you were in utero.
Yes, exactly right. This is to prevent birth defects or
Miscarriage.
miscarriage. Yes, miscarriage.
Women who previously miscarried.
Yes.
And yeah, I'm the same way. It was military.
A lot of military because they were on top. That was they were on top. They were doing everything they could.
If
Yeah.
they had a previous miscarriage, they would
Yep.
automatically place on.
Yep. Good. I think there was a question back there. Yes.
You have reproductive history on there as a factor.
Yes.
Does that mean more kids, like if you had kids, it increases your risk, or if you haven't had kids,
So great question. So the question is, if the reproductive history, if you have more kids, does that increase your risk? So actually, the biggest factor is the age at which you have your first child, and it has to do with the breastfeeding. There's sort of a process there that differentiates these epithelial cells in the ducts that we talked about that are susceptible to the cancer-related changes, and if those get differentiated at a fairly early age. And that's another change, right? The average age of first childbirth was probably the early 20s until fairly recently, and now we're pushing on up into the mid-30s probably. So that's a longer period for those undifferentiated cells to be exposed. So earlier periods and longer exposure until those cells in the breast get differentiated. That's a recipe for increased risk. And again, these are not much you can do about these. Race is in there, age is a factor certainly, but these are all risk factors. Yes.
If you did or did not breastfeed, is that a factor?
Yes. So they thought it was age of first child, but it turns out if women did not breastfeed, then their risk was the same as, or very close to someone who had a child later in life. And so it's the breastfeeding that's causing that differentiation of those cells. Yes.
What about no pregnancies?
No pregnancies they're in the same boat as a later pregnancy too. So that is a risk factor. Nulliparity they call it. Never having a child is a risk factor. It's not on the order of some of these others, but it contributes. There's a increased risk in women who have never really breastfed is really what that's associated with.
Increase the risk?
Yes. Yeah. Most cancers are, with few exceptions, most cancers increase with age, and so age is kind of a risk factor for all of them.
I got a letter recently, a couple of years ago, that said that once I turned 80, I didn't need to have a mammogram anymore.
Yeah.
Do you believe that's true?
Well, yeah. There really is a. If you kind of live through that period, that's kind of the peak period of breast cancer is kind of from 50 to 80, and then it really drops off. And so if you make it through that, you're good. Go. Yes.
Do miscarriages also play into that?
I think from the standpoint if you didn't bring to term and breastfeed, yes, I think I don't think there's any increased risk from miscarriage itself. I think it's the lost opportunity to have breastfed that child is I think what the risk is. Yep.
Now, with the birth control pills situation, and there's now situations where you're not taking the 7 pills for the menstrual cycle to develop. You're trying to put off menstruation and only have it 4 times a year or something like that. What is your thoughts on that? How does that play out?
Yeah, there's a hormone replacement story, both in terms of later in life and after menopause, but also I will say it's when they've gone, the initial birth control pills were what we refer to as unopposed estrogen, and so that was bad that in terms of breast proliferation and susceptibility. So lower doses of estrogen with a little progesterone is the sort of the magic mark on that, where it seems like it's doing the job that it's intended without greatly increasing. I won't go to say it's zero, but I think the risk is greatly diminished with the more recent developments of the birth control medications. So I got that right? Good.
Less menstruation leads to less breast cancer, or do you know?
Less menstruation. I don't know that's. I haven't seen that as a risk factor so much. I think it was the unopposed estrogen that really was the driver of that, and I think that's where the risk is. Other risk factors, these are the ones that can be controlled. Diet's a big one. Obesity we mentioned, exercise. We talked about breastfeeding already, alcohol, and we also talked about the not having children as a risk factor. And again, I wouldn't say it's on the order of this 30% that we're seeing with some of these others, but it's a contributor. So getting at this question, why is there so much breast cancer today? And this is kind of a summary of what we talked about. So a girl born today has a 1 in 8 chance of developing breast cancer in her lifetime. Absorb that for a second. That's terrible. 12% lifetime risk is what that refers to. And again, we talked about menarche arriving, the first period arriving at 10 to 12 now, and then we wait typically 20, 25 years to have that first child. Just the way our society is kind of working these days. So that result is this incompletely differentiated breast epithelial tissue exposed to high hormone levels for a very long time, and that's one of the factors. And then the other, so this is that doesn't come out very well, but that's a frontier woman statue. And again, we said she was out in the fields working hard and having these kids early, and her first menstrual cycle was probably at 17 or 18, married by 20, having kids 21. That's what. Where the risk was lower anyway than for breast cancer. Here's one that we can really do something about though. So we eat too much of the wrong things. How do we get into burger and Coke kind of affinity? I don't know, but too many calories. We sit too much until we weigh too much, and now this is good news. But we're living longer than the frontier days for sure. And so that's a combination. I think we've already talked about this. More hormones, more chronic inflammation from the diet and the obesity. These are key drivers of breast cancer, and so that's what's accounting for the risk. Now, there's some good news here. It is no longer a death sentence by any means. The treatments have gotten much better, and as has the early detection. So these high definition mammography approaches for early detection are really catching things much earlier than we used to. The effective treatments, particularly, we know a lot more about the biology of breast cancer, and so we know a lot more about how to target them, the specific types of breast cancer. And so it's not all doom and gloom here. We are seeing some progress. And the really good news, we're up to about 98% survival in 5 years with breast cancer if the cancer is detected early and it's local. So this is a strong argument to get you get your friends and in-laws to get their screening. There's lots of controversy about mammography. When should you start? How often? But there's no doubt it saves lives. The American Cancer Society still very strongly recommending getting that mammography going around 50 years of age, and work with your doctor in terms of your family history and other factors to kind of dictate how often that should be done. But this can save lives, because if it's detected at the metastatic level, it's a lot harder to treat, and so the success rate is much lower. So early is good, and so we're making progress on the treatment side, on the detection side. But one thing I want to emphasize tonight is prevention, and that's something that we pay a lot of attention to, because we're doing much better, but it's still tough to treat. And those of you who have been through it know this. There are physical and emotional scars from that, and so we're grateful for the progress, and survivors and their families very grateful for the breakthroughs that allow them to survive this. But we want to do better for our daughters, don't we? And not put them through this, and that's where prevention comes in. And so the rest of the evening we'll kind of talk about what are some approaches to prevent breast cancer. And again, from the diet side, these phytochemicals, these bioactive components in plant foods have some really nice anti-cancer activity as we unpack them. And so that's one area that's clear. Omega-3 fatty acids have emerged. They kind of lost favor there for a while in terms of some of the other diseases. But maybe not for cancer. They're kind of having a renaissance because of their very strong anti-inflammatory target agents, and so we're seeing some really nice effects in breast cancer, particularly. I'll share that. And then the biggie, I think, is this weight control issue, and what do we do about this obesity epidemic, and getting a handle on that. If you want more information on that, and I think the source of the best information on anything related to diet, physical activity, and cancer is this American Institute for Cancer Research, World Cancer Research Fund expert report. First one came out in '97, another in '07. Since that time, there's you can actually go online, www.aicr.org, and get any question you want to ask about nutrition and cancer, you will find in this terrific production. And there's a 2017 version. I'm actually hard at work on my piece of that, so we're contributing at UNC to this effort. But the executive summary, if you will, the key recommendations, and that for really all cancers, these aren't breast cancer specific. But keeping that weight issue under control, be as lean as possible within the normal range of weight, be physically active as part of everyday life, and then limit the consumption of energy-dense foods, particularly sugar-sweetened beverages is kind of they're kind of no-nos in many ways, and in terms of trying to do this. Those are the top 3 recommendations. The others relate to this sort of getting more plant food than animal food kind of on your plate notion. So eat mostly foods of plant origin, limit your intake of particularly red meat, and avoid processed meat. I don't know if you noticed in the papers or online, it's a bad year for meat. It's a good year for coffee. Coffee, every cancer seemed like came up, coffee was great. And we're starting to study that and to figure out if there's some biology to that. But the red meat story, and processed meats particularly, didn't have a very good year. Several cancers came out, and there was a big International Agency for Research on Cancer report that actually deemed processed meat a carcinogen. So be careful. I thought that was a little strong. It kind of met their criteria, so they ran with it. But it just does show that there are things in the processed meat, nitrosamines that are preservatives and the like that look like pro-cancer, and so that's something I sure cut my consumption of processed meat, hot dogs, and lunch meat and that sort of thing. That should be a rare part of your diet. Yes.
What about the uncured, no nitrates, no nitrites?
Yeah, not much data on it. I think my read of it is it's mainly the nitrates and nitrites that are driving. Safer certainly. Yeah. I think that's you're at least eliminating that part of the story. There may be something with the heme iron, but that the signal is so much weaker with unprocessed meats that I think it's. Yes, I think it's clear. To my read, processed meats bad. Red meats, moderations. I think I see a much weaker signal with the red meat story. Yes.
The point being, I think, is just to eat food that's close to the way nature.
Yeah, that's.
And red meat is.
Hey, you're still on my conclusion.
But now, if you find if you're eating, grass-fed, if you're eating conventionally raised cows, then all their toxins are stored in their fat, and you don't.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good, so keep that one in mind. It's a general theme. Get, foods closer to, when you think about it, half the foods that we eat, you can't even really define what's in it, right? You can't even tell what's there because it's all processed up. And so the more you can tell, oh yeah, there's oats and wheat and, that the better you are. The less processed is better in my view. So thank you. We'll get back to that. Yes?
Evolutionary situation was we had very little meat. We had mainly roots and nuts and berries.
And we exercise getting them.
And the issue, yes, red meats may be a problem, but what do you think about the grain issue that we have now? We are a grain society. Everything is wheat, barley, those types of things, which was not around in our evolutionary cycle.
Yeah, it's a good question about the, we have gotten, our carbohydrate intake in general has really jumped up relative to where it was 50 years ago. And so in grains, and a lot of our grains are highly processed into crackers and cereals and that sort of thing. So very simple, easily digested. And so I think that's part of it. Again, getting away from, I'm not necessarily advocating for the paleo diet. Thank you. Not necessarily all the way back to paleo, but maybe getting back a little bit away from some of all this processing is a good idea. Yes?
I wanted to hear what he thought about sugar. I've often read that cancer cells maybe have an affiliation with sugar.
Yeah, again, this carbohydrate intake and this drive to, we'll get into that mechanistically. That's a major factor. That insulin-like growth factor signaling pathway that's responding to the sugar in driving, growth of many cancer cells seems to be a big part of it. If you want the bottom line and you want to get back to your meal for a few minutes and ignore the rest of the biology we get into, that's the bottom line. Insulin-related, insulin resistance and insulin-related factors, inflammation, put those two together, those are the two major things. And that's what obesity is driving that. When you think about obesity being, you got all this hyperinsulinemia. We'll get into that, I think, in just a moment. But great question. Sugar, not necessarily only sugar intake. I mean, it's simple carbohydrates in general are driving some of these factors. So what are we talking about? Moving away from a diet like this, and this makes that point. I mean, it's hard to recognize what these are, isn't it? Is that meat or what is that? What went into this stuff? So you see this highly processed. Lots of fat and sugar, lots of calories overall in that. Very simple, complex, dense calories here. Moving from that to this, where you can actually recognize, okay, when you have your grains, let's recognize that let's eat the whole grains maybe, but leaner protein sources, more natural, and a mix of things. I kind of like that kind of color concept of having a colorful plate because then you're getting a mix of many of these things. And what's so good is it here's a good question. Is it the presence of good things in the fruits and vegetables, or is it the lack of bad things that because you're not eating so much of the maybe the more processed and not so good things? And I think the bottom line is it's a combination of the two. Clearly there are good things that are linked to cancer protection in fruits and vegetables. And just looking at this, you see these as really yummy kind of fruits and vegetables, but a nutritional biochemist says, oh yeah, it's a flavonoid vehicle or a polyphenolic or a folate carrier, and it's true. These are these what we call bioactive food components. Phytochemicals, another term for these, have some anti-cancer activity, and so that looks like maybe probably what's driving this notion of eating more of these types of foods. And so phytochemical-rich foods that have, beginning, I won't say all of them are firmly established, these are still research topics, but beginning to be at least well characterized in experimental systems and now linking to human data. But you'll recognize some of these things, sulforaphanes in broccoli, for example, or I don't know, garlic's up here somewhere. Curcumin, that's the curry component pretty strong anti-inflammatory agent. Turmeric, exactly. So these are these are probably good things to promote in the diet, and that again, having a good variety of fruits and vegetables is the way to go. And these bioactive food components have known anti-cancer effects in terms of affecting the growth side of things, the cell cycle, impacting carcinogen metabolism. There's some pro-immune effects of some of these agents. We're studying some of the energy metabolism components. Curcumin's very interesting in that regard. Some are actually mimic hormones, but they're weak hormones. So that's where the soy and some of the polyphenolics come in. If you actually look at their structure, they look like estrogen, and they'll bind to the estrogen receptor, but they don't kick on much of a signal from the estrogen receptor, but they compete with normal estrogen, and so sort of takes the fuel out of the fuel line a little bit, if you will. With some of these, so these are good. So emphasizing the kind of the pro effects of these healthful things, that's something to promote. And again, to me, this has been the biggest story in cancer in the last couple of years, and we've contributed some to this. But this U.S. obesity epidemic, and it's affecting many other countries besides the U.S. Really driving cancer risk. We should be doing much better given all the advances in therapy, early detection, et cetera. This one risk factor is pushing against us in a big way, in sort of unwriting our some of our gains, and that's not good. So I was born in 1958, and the prevalence of obesity was about 12% in the U.S., and now it's 36, actually getting close to 40% from the latest data. So that's more than a tripling just in my lifetime. So you can't blame our genes on that one, can you?
What's the medical definition of obese?
Yes, it's a bit more of a functional definition in terms of your body mass index being anything over 30 kilogram per meter squared is sort of the classic definition. So you can calculate this. And so it's basically your height, your weight in kilogram over your height in meters squared. Anything over 30 is considered obese. Yeah, you can go online. You can go online. You can go online and pop your weight and your height in, and it'll spit it out. So there are medical definitions too that we get, but this is sort of the functional definition that's kind of everybody's tends to use. And so now we have 7 out of 10 adults with a BMI greater than, this is body mass index is what this is called, with a BMI greater than 25 is overweight. And so 7 out of 10 are in either overweight or obese. And getting close, like I said, to 40% of U.S. adults are actually in the obese category. So absorb that a minute. 4 out of 10 adult Americans are obese by definition. That's driving many of our health concerns right now. And rising, getting close to 7% of our colleagues in the U.S. here are in the extreme obese category. So that's a BMI greater than 40. And so that's having a huge impact on a number of diseases. What about cancer? Again, about within 12 or 15 years ago, you wouldn't have thought that this was a major risk factor, but the data's really emerged on this. So about half of endometrial cancers, about a quarter of pancreatic, kidney, gallbladder, about 20% of breast cancers are thought to be actually caused, actually driven by obesity. Yes?
How do you know that they're caused?
Well, that's a good question. This is largely what the field of epidemiology, and so these are really mathematical approaches to what factors are contributing to the rates of cancer. I will say the data's gotten stronger because we've gotten all these what are termed prospective studies now, huge prospective. Basically, all of Europe is being studied as a single cohort, and so they were able to take measurements, take diet measurements, take blood samples 30 years ago, and then follow these folks in their outcome. And so those with so there's basically a mathematical calculation that half of if you developed endometrial cancer, the odds were tremendously much higher that you were obese than women that didn't, for example. And so they can do, they can track this. There's a pretty robust field of sort of statistical approaches to kind of parse out what are the drivers of these diseases.
Do you think that that's true?
I do. I can replicate it in animal models, for example, which to me is a step that I tend to be a little skeptical on those initial findings. They're associations. They are mathematical associations that are driven today by huge numbers and huge power. So I begin to believe that to a greater extent, but I don't fully believe it until I make one of my animal models of one of these cancers, obese versus lean, and I see it. That tells me the biology is there, and so that's my final proof. I'm a little more skeptical than most. I probably don't need to be that skeptical, and I certainly think it's these numbers are pretty firm. They're tracked very closely, and so we're seeing a consistency. These haven't changed much, even with the advent of huge now data sets and tremendous follow-up over these years. Harvard has been following 150,000 nurses for about 40 years in a similar manner. Europe, like I say, all of Europe, it's called EPIC, European Prospective Study in Cancer, has been going on now for 30 years. There's a few other of these huge cohorts. Basically, the state of Hawaii is a whole cohort too. So you begin to see these same patterns showing up in different populations, using different methodologies, different even diet, but this obesity story seems to be very much there. So yes, I believe it. There you go. So support for this breast cancer obesity is there. How? I get that question. How would obesity impact cancer or breast cancer specifically? And we talked a little bit about this. So we know this phenotype, this obese phenotype, is linked with insulin resistance, hyperglycemia, diabetes. We've known that forever. That's a clear connection between obesity and these diabetic factors. We also know obesity is linked to dyslipidemias, particularly hypertriglyceridemia. There's increased waist circumference. There's increased blood pressure associated with obesity. Those are clear. In fact, I've asterisked them because these are the classic metabolic syndrome components. There's actually a disease category, metabolic syndrome, and it's this four components that make that up. Now, in addition to these metabolic syndrome components, we've also come to know that obesity is a chronic state of inflammation. Now, it's not like an infection where you get this massive burst of cytokines and other inflammatory factors. It's a chronic low dose. Some might call it smoldering inflammation. And so living for sort of under this chronic level of inflammation seems to be a major cancer risk factor, and we'll talk more about that. There are changes in kind of our blood system related to coagulation and blood vessel formation. And when you think about it, how would this fast-growing cancer feed itself if it couldn't get a new a decent supply of blood to itself? And so some of these effects relate to that. There's a term for it called angiogenesis, new blood vessel formation, and obesity enhances that process. There are also altered adipokines. These are the factors. So we have basically. I'm not even going to say that. We used to think there was a kind of a set number of fat cells, and they would just get larger. I think that notion is being disproven. But certainly, we store a lot of this excess energy in fat cells, and one of the responses when we do that, as these fat cells accumulate triglyceride, the sort of fatty components of this energy storage process, is to make these factors called adipokines. So leptin, you may have heard of, it's this fat hormone, some refer to. So the more adipose tissue we have, the more leptin we make, and it's a pretty important sensor. It kind of tells the body, it actually crosses the blood-brain barrier and communicates to the brain, sort of energy stores. And unfortunately, it's also probably linked to some of these cancers. So higher leptin for example, is a major component of obesity. There's also elevated insulin like growth factor 1. It works side by side with insulin, but this is one we've worked hard on over the last 20 years. This thing really seems to be a pro-cancer, really a driver of cancer growth, this IGF-1. So it partners with insulin, but whereas insulin really works to get glucose into cells is an endocrine factor, this seems to be more of a growth driver, and so dangerous in the cancer setting. So the bottom line, here's that 25% number of cancer deaths per year are thought to be associated with causing cancer overall. So it's a major risk factor. The American Society for Clinical Oncology, these are the folks that treat cancer, came out with a position statement on obesity and cancer because it emerged as such an important factor. So they usually don't deal with risk factors. They usually deal only with the treatment side of things. But they felt like this is becoming really probably one of the major issues in cancer facing us. And so a central challenge in cancer prevention and care, by their calculations, this is the leading preventable cause of cancer in the United States. So think about that for a second. Of all the things, smoking and other things, the sense is this is the leading preventable cause of cancer. It not only increases risk, but why these folks particularly got involved, these are all the oncologists in the United States, is that it increases recurrence and really impacts the response to therapy. That's something we've been studying, and that is so true. So not only is risk increased, but if you develop cancer and you're obese, the ability of the chemotherapy to do its job is diminished, and so that's contributing to some of this. And their estimates by 2030, we could be up to half a million Americans per year diagnosed with obesity-related cancer, unless we do something about this. So this is becoming number one. So what do we do? And this is a question that over here in the Nutrition Research Institute we are very concerned about, and particularly what do we do about the roughly 720 million adults that are already obese? How do we decrease their risk of developing cancer is a question we've asked. And in our view, we needed a mechanistic approach to kind of pick this apart and know how to design interventions that will have an impact. And so I won't bore you. This is my life, and been my life for a long time. Is kind of pulling out these mechanisms, and I won't bore you too much with it. But what we find is that this sort of pattern of ours, where we have high energy intake, low physical activity, leading to chronic energy balance, obesity, this metabolic syndrome we talked about, that drives a number of changes sort of in our system, in our whole body. So insulin's up, that insulin like growth factor 1 is up, these cytokines that are relating to inflammation are up, and so this is a pattern that we've gotten into that drives many of the processes related to cancer. So growth factor signaling is one of these, and that's part of the insulin story that we talked about. Inflammation is another, and these vascular changes are a third. And we think that those are the three things that come together to really drive obesity-related cancers and increase both risk and progression of the disease. And so what we're finding now is there are changes in our microbiome that seem to be associated with this. Obesity really seems to move that around. There are changes in our adipose tissue that make things more inflammatory when they get engorged with these with the triglyceride. So that's part of it. There's an estrogen picture too for breast cancer that's very important. That obesity seems to impact estrogen metabolism and signaling, and so these are all kind of coming together in a perfect storm to push this disease forward. So I'll wrap up with just a few things that we're doing over here at the Institute. And a key question, we keep hearing the word pivot. We heard that all summer, right? These politicians are going to pivot now to the main election. We did a pivot here as well because our focus was really on understanding what drives breast cancer risk in relation to obesity. Our pivot was, okay, we know that's a risk factor. What do we do about it? How do we disconnect that risk? And so we asked the question, does intentional weight loss following chronic obesity reverse these pro-cancer effects? And if not, what can we do, maybe combining the weight loss with something to basically break these connections that we're seeing and decrease risk? And when we looked in the literature, and what drove sort of this pivot for us was this glaring gap in the preclinical, and that refers to all the laboratory kinds of studies, as well as the epidemiologic, and that refers to those population studies I was mentioning earlier. There's really very little work done on the impact of weight loss following obesity, following chronic obesity on cancer. We kind of know with diabetes, right? An obese type 2 diabetic person, if they lose weight and doesn't even take that much weight loss, we'll see a nice change in their insulin sensitivity and their diabetes risk. So does that go on in cancer? We don't know. The data's not there. Surprisingly, little data there. There's one exception, bariatric surgery. So people who have gone through weight loss surgery and have been, there's enough of those folks that have been studied that they show a decreased risk of several cancers, including breast cancer. So there's hope, but that's kind of different than dietary weight loss. And the data on diet weight loss is minimal, and it's not all that encouraging when I look at it. So maybe we need to be a little smarter about how to do this. So I'll give you an example. We have someone who's a bariatric surgeon here, as I understand. So is that right? We're working with it anyway. Is that right? Okay. But working with the bariatric group. We chose to study particularly a technique called sleeve gastrectomy. So you're basically taking the sort of the pouch of the stomach, removing about 60% of the stomach, and so going from a pouch to a sleeve, if you will. That's where the name comes from. It's the most common form of bariatric surgery in the U.S. Today. And again, we wanted to look at, is this impacting cancer? And if so, what are the mechanisms and what can we learn from it? I get asked this question, so are you proposing that surgery is the way, bariatric surgery is the way to prevent cancer? No, it's very expensive, very tough on the patients. Our goal is to try to understand what's going on here, since it seems to be working in human populations. Can we get more defined in terms of the mechanisms that are going on and mimic those, maybe with diet, maybe with omega-3 fatty acids plus diet, maybe with omega-3 fatty acids plus diet plus something else, to try to mimic this effect. And so I'll kind of walk you through this. I kind of got into golf this summer, so I put up a golf leaderboard from our lab here. So again, asking the question, does moderate weight loss after a long period of obesity reverse the pro-cancer effects of obesity? And if not, what can effectively be combined with that? We actually brought this into our experimental model systems, and we're doing them in parallel with human studies. So I've got a freezer full of tissue from women before and after their bariatric surgery. But what we were particularly wanting to do is bring this into our animal systems and our experimental systems so we could get mechanism figured out. And so here's what we found. Never being obese was the best in terms of our breast cancer model development, and that makes sense, right? So this was in the case of our animal studies, keeping them on a kind of a healthy diet all the way through their life, never allowing them to get obese. The worst situation was to allow them to get obese and not doing anything about it. They have the worst outcome in terms of breast cancer. So it makes sense, right? These are the extremes. They were on continuous, what we call diet-induced obese regimens all their life, and they had the earliest breast cancer development, the worst outcomes from it. This was interesting. So getting very close to the never being obese was being obese and then the bariatric surgery. So in our mouse system, it worked. It's reflecting what we saw in the human. So again, confidence in the human data. We're seeing biological replication of that. Not bad was another intervention. So obese, but instead of doing surgery, we put them on what's called the 5-2 diet. Anybody heard of that one? Okay, it's big in Europe. I have a bunch of Irish postdocs in my lab, and all their families are on these things. So I'm thinking about actually trying it out. But anyway, it's 5 days of a healthy diet, 2 days of a pretty low calorie, low carb diet. And so it's not Atkins. If you're on Atkins, you're on low carb all the time. You get into ketosis and kind of get uncomfortable around some of that. This prevents some of that. It kind of dances right up to the ketotic line on those 2 days. But it seems to be enough. People seem to lose weight. They seem to maintain it better on this diet. And in our hands, it's a lot more anti-inflammatory than just about any other diet we've done. We compare it to a low-calorie diet, a low-carb, high-fat, or a high-carb, low-fat, and they were comparable. So at least in our hands, it didn't seem to matter if you did low-carb or low-fat. If you got the calories down, the animals lost weight, and their tumors we saw protection with that. Not quite to the same level as the surgery, but certainly protection. Now, if we just go after the inflammation with either an aspirin or omega-3 fatty acids, that worked pretty well too. They were much better than the always obese. And so what we're trying now is so we want to mimic the surgery, right? But we don't want to do the surgery on everybody. What happens if you do something like the intermittent fasting with an aspirin or an omega-3 regimen? So you're tackling several things at once. You're tackling the inflammation, tackling some of that insulin resistance that these diets do, and so far so good. We're looking like that's the way to go. But again, we're trying to figure out, can we mimic the surgery without doing the surgery and replicate these anti-cancer effects of this bariatric surgery. So I think I'll stop there and we'll turn to questions a little bit. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to answer any further questions, and do see Suzanne or me or whoever else is here from NRI. We're really proud of our facilities. Love to show them off if you're interested. Thanks. Yes.
Did you,
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Did you do any, on the aspirin, was there a dose that you found, 81, 50, 100, 60, 325? Did y'all ferret that out, or did you just say that?
So the question is that, how do we come up with a dose of aspirin? So this is an important question for anybody thinking about doing animal work that you want to try to relate to human, because mice are not people, and you could criticize a lot of the animal research for missing the mark. So what if we're 80 times higher than what a human could ever consume, and we find an anti-cancer effect? So what? That has no relevance. So we've worked hard on all these. We've got a number of things that we're trying to do this parallel mouse-human work on. And in part, the human work is very, as you can imagine, it takes a long time to get out to a cancer endpoint. Our mouse models are typically 6 to 9 months. And so we can get a lot done with that, all the way out from nothing to cancer in that period. So the potential for power is there, but if we don't line them up, will not be very informative. And so we work very hard to do that by first matching doses. So we ask the question, what dose of omega-3 fatty acids and their metabolites do we get when we give them to people? We use Levasa. It's basically a drug form, GlaxoSmithKline form of DHA and EPA. It's very pure, and we can match that in the animals and match their level exactly. And so that's how we approach it with the aspirin as well. And so we're in the range of basically it's on the high side. I would say it's probably more like an arthritic dose of some of these anti-inflammatory agents that we see. So we're not messing around too much, with the low end, but still it's humanly feasible for sure. And that's something we try to pay attention to, because I'm on my high horse about that with my colleagues right now, and writing some stuff about we got to match the human, or we're not going to be able to contribute to anything.
Higher doses of aspirin is ultra-genic. So,
yes.
You've got a risk-benefit ratio there.
That's right. That's exactly right. So we're on the high side, but we're paying attention to that for sure, and we're avoiding some of that kidney and other problems. Yes.
There's been a lot of questions or studies or diets coming out in relation to hormone levels and hormone impacted by foods that you eat, the diets you eat, and in turn relating that to the cancers that you're exposed to. Can you talk a little bit about the hormone level food connection? I mean, even relating to the cortisol and, you know, all that nine yards.
Yeah, that'd be a great question for a food scientist and I'm a lousy food scientist, so I won't be able to say much about it other than the fact that yes, that there certainly are you know, foods that can impact that. I mentioned that's a large aspect of the soy and some of these phytochemicals is actually to interfere with, you know, they actually will kind of bind to the same receptor but poorly activate them, and so that's a positive. I think you're talking more about, you know, are there foods that actually contribute in a negative way, perhaps,
Well, I mean,
too?
it's like my mother and sister are both breast cancer, and I'm in the sister study, and
Oh.
one of the things that they asked us, and we tried to track, you know, they were told to stay away from the soy and things of that nature because of the estrogenic nature. Flaxseed was another.
Flaxseed, yeah.
All that.
So-
And I was trying to figure out, is there a correlation, or, I mean, is it something that was myth years ago, or is it still relevant?
A bit, I would say from the prevention side, that's turning into an advantage that they are interacting with the estrogen pathway. Now, from a treatment side, that's where the concern, I think that's probably the major concern that's residual, because let's say you're on tamoxifen, which is a selective estrogen receptor modulator, but you're also taking a whole lot of soy or flaxseed, which is a lignan, which is converted in the gut to some of these estrogenic molecules, then it's really hard to hit your tamoxifen dose when you've got these other sort of estrogen. They're actually interfering with the tamoxifen effect because of that. So from a prevention side, I would say maybe I'm sure there's some concern on, you know, being tracked still, but in general, the fact that they interfere with the natural estrogen is thought to be net positive from a prevention side. You're reducing that signal in a prevention setting. From a treatment setting, yes, definitely talk to your doc if you're going through it about other supplements, because, you know, it may seem benign, but if it has estrogenic activity, it's really hard to treat you then. You know, it's really hard to hit the right estrogen or aromatase inhibitor dose if you're changing that a bit. Yes?
It's an old question, apple and pear, body shape.
I like pears better, but that's...
Yeah, and I just was wondering how that...
I'm getting hungry, so I didn't have dinner yet. So.
I just wondered how that related to your, you know...
Yes.
Dermatological studies versus, you know, the abdominal opacity
Yes.
picture you have is more of an apple shape, and how that plays out.
Okay, so the question is about body shape, apple versus pear, and it has to do with where the adipose tissue is accumulating. So it's really that central adiposity that appears to be the most metabolically harmful in terms of pro-inflammatory effects, pro-metabolic related
People
cancer.
get confused. They see a large belly, they think it's fat. There's the external fat, there's the muscle tissue, and then there's underneath that.
It's the fat around the organs that's
right,
yes.
abdominal opacity
Yep.
that's there. And you can, pear shape usually has the external fat on the opposite side of the
Yeah,
body.
often in the legs and
Right.
it is in general, it's the apple, it's the central adiposity. Even though you're right, it's not always the case. You can have a lot of subcutaneous adipose and still be kind of apple shaped, but it's an indicator that you've got around the central organs, liver, fatty liver. It seems to be a driver of some of the inflammatory processes. That seems to be the dangerous fat. That redistribution and activation of these pro-cancer pathways is thought to be the risk there. Yes?
The aspartame question.
Aspartame, yes, sweeteners. I was just at the University of Illinois last week, and a colleague there is doing a lot of work on the sweeteners, and I had high hopes for stevia, but her data, I just bought a big old thing of stevia too, and so I'm now drinking my coffee completely black, and so I am concerned. I think what her data is suggesting is that all of these artificial sweeteners really bind tightly to these olfactory receptors, these taste receptors, and keep them activated. And so even though you're not getting the calories, these olfactory receptors are driving signals in other parts of the body. And so you're kind of getting still this insulin response. And yeah, exactly. And she actually had data on that they bind so tightly that it takes more and more. And I noticed that too. At first, just a little bit was really sweet, and then I found myself kind of too big old to get the same sweet. You had to keep going. She said, yeah, it's because it's binding and activating those receptors much more potently than sugar actually. And so it's a good. I mean, I don't want to ding the industry. That there's not a huge amount of published data out there, but a lot of concern about the metabolic effects. And the other thing that about the same time, another colleague is finding microbiota changes from these things, like weird metabolic things showing up in blood and probably getting other places from the artificial sweeteners. Like, and only until they started really analyzing is what is that? Well, it's actually from the artificial sweetener, but it's showing up in not just in the gut. And so that's so those were two strikes enough for me. I'm off of them. I'm afraid to be. I will say in defense of them, they're very low levels. They are so sweet that they get such a strong sweet taste that you're not getting a lot of it. And her take was occasionally it's fine. What you don't want is like I was doing 2 cups of coffee with a couple spoonfuls of it, and just driving it the whole time. She says she treats herself to a Diet Coke every once in a while and just likes the taste of it. So, and she studies it every day. So I don't want to scare off too much, but I do think there's something to that constant exposure is doing things. And interesting, we found some of these olfactory receptors came out in our breast cancer. Some of our tumor samples, that pathway is getting activated in the tumors. This is sense of smell stuff. What's it? But they're signaling detectors, and so it makes sense that the body's using them throughout the body. But anyway, good question. And on a personal side, I'm starting to avoid them. Yeah. Sure. Yes.
On a similar vein, one of the graphics that stood out to me was the one that showed like diet is 30% of cancer cases, but food additives was very low. So how do you divorce those two and determine, is it the food additive or is it what you're eating, and how do you separate that out?
Yeah, that's tough because so many foods have the colorants and so on. But there has been research done on where they have separated that out, and I will say that kind of analysis is, I would say, is probably it's as much estimate, I guess I would say, as it is hard fact. So it's possible that some of the effect that they're attributing to diet overall there might be a contribution from say colorants or other food additives contributing. Clearly, some of those food additives do have activity. There's no doubt about that. But the data that I've seen on that, it's not of the same order of magnitude. These are relatively. Now, where it might get a little different is that some people have actually some sensitivities, allergic type of reactions to some of those components. There you could get into a whole different ballgame. So that's where the food additives could be, if there's a sensitivity and it's driving inflammation, for example, you could see in those individuals a bigger impact. But overall, the work that's been done to separate those suggests that it's definitely not the food additives that's the smoking gun of that. It's really when you get right down to it, it's largely the quantity of food that overwhelms everything else, really. Yeah. Yes. Vitamin D, the most controversial vitamin in the world right now. Yeah.
Just from the aspect that it seems to be very protective against a lot of chronic diseases, including cancer, is that something that you guys have been studying at all?
Yes. What about vitamin D? Is it part of the solution? And that's a very good question. It's probably the most. In terms of grants right now, it's probably the most researched vitamin of all. So it's the hottest topic right now. There's, and it kind of goes back to this question, many of the studies were done at such high levels where the anti-cancer activity was seen, that we missed the mark on a lot of that. And so it may have activity, but you can't get there based on the cell culture data or the animal data that's been published that kind of was driving some of the interest. So people are going back and really looking at this in these epi studies. There's a hint, but I will say it doesn't look like, I'm going to go out on a limb and suggest that there's probably not one single micronutrient that is going to save us all. That's going to be one. It's a combination of things, and I think that tells us over and over. We were so hopeful about beta carotene, right, in the 80s and 90s. Remember that story? And huge trials, and if anything, it made things worse. In folks that were long-term smokers, for example, where it went in. Again, every time we've tried to do a single agent at a high level and ask it to save us, it hasn't. That's just not probably the way to go. So something more broad. I think that's why I think weren't you the one that brought up the point about getting back to whole foods? So there's the rest of that sentence. Is getting back to that. Yes.
Interesting point. You saying that some of the readings that I've read is that you need balance.
You need a balance.
So if you have a large amount of one, it turns off like a B vitamin.
Yes.
A large amount of one, it can develop a balance of your other.
Yes, that's exactly right. So I'm not a big fan there. And actually, I think that you see the funding trends going away from that, where you really can't get a single, other than vitamin D, where there's still some interest, you can't get a single agent grant funded now because it just doesn't make any sense for the reasons you said. Yes?
What about the safety of organic versus conventional grown fruits and vegetables?
Yeah, I wish organic wasn't so doggone expensive, because that's
That's where the hormones can come in.
yes, because I do think that there's, it can be taken to an extreme, but I think in general, one, they're typically organic, seems to be better cared for. So I think there's probably more nutrient, more healthful aspects. It just seems fresher and not picked green as much and that sort of. But there are concerns about pesticides and their accumulation. The data's not completely clear.
There also have been some studies that show that there are multiple times more phytonutrients in organic.
That's what I was saying. I think it's because they're typically fresher and in some ways better cared for.
The soil a lot, because whatever is in the soil is what we're ultimately
Yep.
putting into our bodies. And if the soil is healthier and happier, then we're bringing more nutrients.
Yeah, I think when you think about it, you're let's say your apple picked in a more conventional is probably picked green and sits in so that those issues are there. So organic when you can is a good, not a bad idea. Yes.
Well, I think it's scale. What is happening is, of course, the food we're getting is grown on these huge farms, and land that was not intended to be farmed is now being farmed.
Mm-hmm.
As we go toward more organic, so to speak, they become larger entities. And then the scale changes whether that organic material of food is actually safer or better, because now it's grown, having to be produced in larger amounts and higher quantities, and certain things have to happen for that to come to fruition. And so, I like the idea of closer local farms. The further food has to travel,
Yes.
the more you have to do to it to get it to market. Also, I think we as a society need to look at the food that we're having and not look for the perfect apple and the perfect pear and the perfect piece. Having a little brown on it is not
bad.
a thing.
Or misshape or something.
Or
Yeah.
misshape. It
Yeah.
can be very good. We throw so much away.
Yep. So great point. Organic, and I think the hope is as we get more interest in that, the costs will come down because, like you say, it becomes more and more the norm. That'll hopefully we'll see that.
Chemicals have to come in to make it grow bigger.
Yeah,
And grow
that's it.
faster.
Yeah.
To supply the organic. So, you got to get lost.
Yeah. again, let's get on our NC State colleagues. That's they're the food scientists. They need to get going there. Yeah.
I'm going to say thank you for coming, and if you would like to ask Dr. Hursting any additional questions while we're wrapping up, please stay and do so. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. My pleasure.